was an article in Scientific American in the early 70s which compared the efficiency of locomotion for various species of things on the planet. In other words, they measured how much energy it took for a bird to get from point A to point B compared with the energy it took a fish to get the same distance, and a goat and a person and all sorts of other things. And they ranked them. And it turns out the condor won. Condor was the most efficient, and man came in with a rather unimpressive showing about a third of the way down the list. It's somewhat disappointing. But someone there had the insight to test the efficiency of man riding a bicycle. And man riding a bicycle was twice as good as the condor, all the way off the end of the list. And what it really illustrated was man's ability as a tool maker to fashion a tool that can amplify an inherent ability that he has. And that's exactly what we think we're doing. We think we're basically fashioning a 21st century bicycle here, which can amplify an inherent intellectual ability that man has and really take care of a lot of drudgery to free people to do much more creative work.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ERG Powertalk. I'm your host, Joe Santana. That clip you just heard is from the 1981 interview with Steve Jobs, where he predicts the future of AI and software by sharing a profound insight on how computers were basically the mental bicycle of the 21st century, a tool that would enhance our natural, intellectual, and creative abilities. Today, over 4 decades later, surrounded by CAD cams, Alexa, ChatGPT, cleaning robots, and more, we can see how foresightful he was when he uttered those words. And clearly, his ability to prepare for the future guided him and his company to great heights. And today, with everything changing so rapidly, it seems we can all use this uncanny ability to prepare for what's coming next, especially those of us who lead a business or a community. But is this actually a learnable skill? And if so, who needs it? When should they start acquiring it? And how should they learn it? These and more questions are the ones that we will answer today in this episode of ERG Power Talk. And to do that, we have the perfect guest. But before we introduce our guests, let's take a moment to review our mission and acknowledge our supporters. This is ERG Power Talk, and I'm your host, Joe Santana. The purpose of ERG Power Talk is to provide a virtual forum for the exchange of great ideas and inspiration for ERG leaders as well as others interested in supporting ERGs. With ERG Power Talk, there is no more waiting until the next conference and praying that you get the budget to travel to the conference to find great ideas and stimulation toward action. Just subscribe and listen at your convenience. Before we begin, a quick note of thanks to our supporters: Atrium Health, Freighted Health and Wisconsin Medical College, Hiscox, Lee Health, National Audubon Society, Tapestry, Federal Reserve Board, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, Oshkosh Corporation, UL Solutions, and Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, let's go straight to the program. He is the executive director of Teach the Future and a retired associate professor of strategic foresight at the University of Houston, with over 3 decades of expertise in long-term forecasting and planning. And he has co-authored key works on future studies and has delivered keynotes and seminars around the world. He's also facilitated strategic planning for top organizations like IBM and NASA, and is the founder of the Association of Professional Futurists. He holds a PhD in sociology from Michigan State University and is dedicated to advancing futurist thinking in education.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be with you. And with that introduction, there's not much more to say. Thank you very much.
So, Peter, just right off the bat, I just wanted to jump into the Teach the Future organization. It's a nonprofit. It's dedicated to empowering young people to think critically and creatively about the future. And it was founded by you after your tenure at the University of Houston. So why did you start this initiative for young people?
Well, I fell into the futures field. I have to say, I wish it had been the result of a vision or even a strategic plan. I became a futurist quite by accident. I was recruited to teach statistics of all things and research methods at a new branch campus in Houston, the University of Houston, Clear Lake, which was coincidentally and wonderfully right next to the Johnson Space Center. So it was a kind of a high-tech community. People were were building the space shuttle. They were launching Skylab and things like that, and the Apollo-Soyuz missions. The dean there, after the university had been created, went right ahead and said, we teach about the past. Why don't we teach about the future? And this was 1975, and I came in 76. So he started a master's degree called Studies of the Future. My background in sociology was to study social change. I mean, I popped out of college into the world in the late 1960s. I don't know whether you remember or anybody remembers, but there was a lot going on in those times. We think these are turbulent times. I would even say that probably was a little step above that. And that was interesting to me. I was going to be a physicist and not a very good one, but I decided I'd like to understand change and how they're in the streets. There's change going on, all of these things, civil rights, Vietnam, environmental movement, things like that. So I got into Clear Lake and was teaching statistics and hanging out with this faculty who were running this program called Studies of the Future. I said, wait a minute, future, change, future. The reason the future is different is because of change. Maybe I can actually not only teach, but learn how to understand change. And they said, sure, you can teach the course forecasting. And they'd never been taught about forecasting in sociology. They don't talk about the future at all, unfortunately. And that's a whole nother story. So I said, yeah, let me learn how to do that. I built the curriculum, organized the curriculum, and 30 years later, was retiring from that program, turning it over to my colleague who had just gotten his doctorate. I looked around and said I'd been teaching government people, business people, seminars, public speaking, graduate students for 30 years. But who was talking to young people? Who was talking to high school students about their future or the future of the world? Who was talking to undergraduates in college? And of course, the answer was pretty simple. No one. I would say no one, because everybody takes history. Almost every year in our educational system, we're studying the past. And once in a while, you might actually get somebody who applies it to the present, but even that's rare. And not even the word future ever appears in a K-12 or college undergraduate class, I would say. I claim, but I think that's pretty true. So I said, that's got to change. We cannot prepare our students for the future, for their future, by preparing them for the late 20th century. We're preparing them right now using the same strategies, some new information, sure, biotechnology, computer science, coding, all of those things did not exist in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But in terms of their skills, in terms of their ability to adapt to change, anticipate and influence change, there's nothing. Now, a lot of them do well. I mean, Steve Jobs, obviously, he has a famous commencement talk, to speak of him, that he gave at Stanford late in his life. And he says, I dropped out of college because it wasn't preparing me to be what I eventually became. And he was right, it didn't. But there are many people who do very well without the education. But if education has any value at all, let's deal with that 60 to 80% in the median part of the skill set, and give them the chance to understand and to be able to influence their future. So I picked up and said, I have the means, I have the time, I have the background. Let me start this organization. And fortunately, dozens of people around the world have joined our journey and helped us try to put futures thinking into the schools.
That's fascinating, because as you were saying that, it makes so much sense that we spend so much time studying the past, and that's important to understand.
Exactly.
That.
We're not saying don't study the past. No.
No, it is important, but we don't spend enough time looking at signals and asking ourselves, well, where exactly are we going? Because by the time I graduate from, let's say, high school or later college or get a master's degree, where is the world going to be and where am I going to land in that world? And not enough time is spent in that, which seems like such an obvious oversight, because most of what we're going to be doing is going to be in the future. We're not going back to the past.
Unfortunately, some people would like to go back to the past, but
yes.
And unfortunately, it is obvious, and yet we have really, really hard time convincing schools. And schools, I have a great deal of respect. I mean, my wife, 40 years as an educator. I was a teacher at the university. My daughter was a teacher for a while, now working in educational consulting and foresight. So we're a family, we're an education family. And yet, schools do always are looking backwards. They're not looking forwards. So asking them to not only look backwards, but what we describe it's a three-act play. There's a first act, which is the past. There's a second act, which is what's going on today. And the third act is what could happen in the future. Why leave the theater after the second act or even the first act? Come on, let's talk about it. We don't know what's going to happen, but we can discuss it and we can prepare for it nevertheless.
Absolutely. So, Peter, what precisely are some of the skills that you teach when you teach future foresight to young people?
There's a whole list of them, and I can't go through the whole list. Let me give you the three big chunks of what we do teach. First of all, we teach about change. How does change occur? Change comes from two places. It comes from the world and it comes from ourselves. The world will go on. We can't influence most of what's happening. And yet we're not victims. We also have strategies. We also have time and talent and resources to be able to influence the world for ourselves personally, our families, our communities, maybe even in some cases for the larger world. So we should both realize that we are constrained by what the world is doing, and we need to adapt to that. At the same time, we don't want to just sit back and let it happen to us. We want to be able to influence it and have agency and power to do so. We can't have everything we want, but we can have more of what we want if we work at it and do it over a long period of time. Most of us don't have the power to change the world. Some people do, but very few. Most of us, and the ones we're educating, say, no, you can't change the world, but you can change your position in the world. You can do more of what you want and get more of what you want if you take an intelligent way. So the first thing is to understand change. Then the other two things are how is the world changing? What is going to happen? What Jobs was talking about. That's the beginning of it. And he had prescience. Of course, he was brilliant and also knew. I even go back to earlier than that, 1970, the 70s. Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Learning for Tomorrow. And he was talking about learning about change, and he was talking about educating. He wanted to put futures into schools at that time. So inbound change is something that we receive. It's something that happens to us. We have no control or influence over it, and AI and all the things you mentioned are examples of those things. Yet, we are not just victims. We are not passive recipients. We are also active. The analogy I use is if you're a football team or a soccer team or whatever, the visiting team shows up. They're the inbound change. They come with their talent, with their skills. You can't tell them, no, you shouldn't do that. You can't do that. They will play hard to win the game. But at the same time, we have our talent and our skills and our strategies. And so we should look at what the incoming change is and use it as an opportunity to then influence our own. So the three major categories, at the most basic level, understanding change, understanding how to anticipate change, which most people would call forecasting, and then how to influence change, most people would call planning or action. So that is the summary of a whole master's degree at the University of Houston.
I have to say that was masterfully done because it's a really big topic to break down into three categories. I want to take you into one of those categories just for a minute because I think that's really important. And that's the second one that you mentioned, the forecasting piece.
Right.
I think that one of the things that I would love for you to talk about a little bit is when you're looking at these different things that are going on, what's inbound. Some of it is going to be noise and some of it are going to be signals. What are some of the ways that you teach people to separate signals from noise so that they don't end up responding to what is literally the equivalent of static as opposed to responding to the actual message of this is where we're actually going?
Well, I have to back up a second. Every profession has the trick. And we have a trick. I call it a trick. I mean, that's a little bit facetious, but we call it a trick. We don't predict the future. We don't know what is going to happen. We start out with that as a premise. Jobs was correct, but he was also lucky. Toffler was correct, but he was also lucky. People have forecast and predicted. There was a forecast in a very famous and well-done study in the 1960s on the future of space travel. Did they get that wrong or what? We thought we were going to have a space station by 1980 and habitats on the moon by 2000. Well, you and I know that didn't happen. So there are the trick is we do not predict the future. We describe two kinds of futures. The first one is the expected future. And we make a distinction between signals, and you called it signal and noise. We said both are signals. The first kind are strong signals. Strong signals are trends. Strong signals, we have data. We can put it on a chart. If it continues, we will end up 20, 30 years from now with a type of future driven by those trends and plans. I mean, if a government or a business decides to do something, we will be influenced by that. So that's the expected future. But then we think critically about that expected future. Is that guaranteed? No, of course not. Something else could happen. So then we look into what we call weak signals, which are, they're not driving the future, they're not changing the future, but they're out there. Every strong signal at one time used to be a weak signal. So let's not pick the one weak signal, oh, this one is going to be it. No, we take them as a set, as a way of thinking about the fact that there is change out there that we will not be prepared for. We will not anticipate. We will not predict, but we need to be ready for it anyway. So we're talking about adaptability, flexibility, openness to the fact that the future is unknown. It is not the way Jobs described it. There are things that have happened and other things that won't. So the trick in the inbound change is to separate the strong signals, but here's where we're headed, and the weak signals, here's what could happen instead. And that, to me, gives us a full and complete view of the future.
Okay, so here's what I got out of the first half of our discussion with Peter Bishop. 1, regardless of the level of education, most professionals today have not been prepared to live in a rapidly changing world. Traditional education heavily focuses on the past, often neglecting to equip students with skills for navigating future changes. So even the most literate of us can be unprepared for the future. 2, preparing for the future requires understanding change, both external, like technological or social shifts, and internal, like personal growth and adaptability. Recognizing these elements helps us effectively anticipate and adapt to evolving environments. 3, effective futures thinking requires 3 main skills. 1, understanding change. 2, forecasting possible future scenarios. And 3, influencing outcomes. These skills are vital for empowering people to navigate in uncertainty. 4, futures thinking isn't about predicting the future with certainty, but involves outlining expected trends, strong signals, and considering alternative possibilities, weak signals, in order to maintain yourself adaptable. 5, preparing strategies for the future involves another element, which is having a clear vision of our preferred future. In other words, knowing where we would like to steer towards and land. And finally, 6, no one can accurately predict the future, so adaptability and flexibility are crucial. We need to nurture the ability to pivot in response to unforeseen changes, allowing us to remain resilient in a rapidly evolving world. In the next half of our discussion with Peter, we will go deeper into the topic of becoming future literate and specifically look at how this will empower your ERGs to reach higher levels of achievement. All this and more when we come back, but first this. I'll see you on the other side. Are you an ERG group or committee chair struggling to balance your ERG activities with your day job responsibilities? Well, you're not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of passionate ERG leads all around the world that find themselves in the same boat. The only solution found by many is to give up lunch hours and personal time with family and friends. But there is a better way, and that better way is to master the powerful skills that enable you to 1. Set realistic and achievable compelling goals and priorities. 2. Distribute the workload by effectively delegating tasks and responsibilities to others. 3. Communicate in a way that increases your impact with less time and effort on your part. 4. Secure the full and active support of executive sponsors and other senior business leaders. And 5. Fit your ERG leadership work into a reasonable set of time boundaries. And that and more is exactly what tens of thousands of your colleagues have learned to do effortlessly by participating in Supercharge Workshops. Supercharge Workshops was developed by us along the same easy and powerful how-to framework found in our popular Supercharge Your ERGs book. The modular, customizable programs are loaded with fun exercises and tools that will immediately give you back hours of time each day while increasing your ability to achieve high impact and measurable results in both your ERG work and your job. For more details on how you can schedule a Supercharge Workshop session in your organization, go to superchargeworkshops.com. That's https:// Supercharge Workshops, one word with no spaces.com. So don't suffer silently. Take that first step towards stopping your struggle today. Check out Supercharge Workshops. So let me ask you this. As you look at the world around us, and you and I clearly have been around a bit now, right? As we look at the world around us, does it feel like things are moving faster than before? And from your perspective, is that what's actually happening? That instead of moving at the pace that we were moving maybe 50, 60 years ago, that today things seem to be happening by leaps and bounds, thus having that sense of at least anticipating where we're going and being prepared for these alternative things that can end up being where we land makes it even more important than ever before, because it's the speed. It's almost like the difference between when I'm walking and what I have to anticipate versus when I'm driving at 60 miles an hour and I'm going to be from here to there much faster. I have to aim higher. I have to anticipate a little earlier. Would you say that's a fair analogy?
That's a very fair analogy, and I have data that I believe would support the fact that yes, change has picked up in the last 100 years, the last 50 years. In fact, Alvin Toffler again titled his most famous book "Future Shock," and it was the shock of living in a future which was quite different from our past. Humans are socialized into a world when they're young. Their parents, their teachers, their ministers, their mentors prepare them to be good in that world because they don't know the future's world and they don't talk about the future's world. And then 20 or 30 years down the line, they find themselves in another world. And what's the way they say, I didn't sign up for this. I don't like this. And so it's, again, a failure of preparation, and not only within culture, as in parenting, but also within our education system, which is the formal institution that prepares us to be successful as adults. Since we are not talking about change, and we are not talking about the future and the rate of change and adaptability and flexibility, when you get through school, you don't get through school by being adaptable. You get through school by answering the right questions with the right answers. That's the way in history, in science, in math, in almost everything. It's all about right answers. And then you get into a world 20 or 30 years down the line when those right answers are not right anymore. when the questions are not those questions anymore. And we're kind of thrown back, and people who are yearning for the past, yearning for the good old days, it might say, which were not as really as good as they think, but nevertheless, they yearn for it nevertheless, because it's what the world that they knew is the world that they were comfortable in, the world that they felt successful and they were successful in. We are not preparing our students for a different future. We're preparing them for, unfortunately, for the past, for the recent past. And in that extent, the future shock that we're feeling is, I agree with you, it's genuine, it's real. And that doesn't mean that it's made up. It's not just in people's heads. They are being asked to live in a world that they were not prepared to live in.
Absolutely. Just moving a little more now toward what some of the listeners are interested in. They lead various types of communities, various types of DEI and other efforts in their organizations. These efforts clearly also need to address changes that are happening in the world around us. The world is evolving. There are a lot of things that people do today that are based on practices that they call best practices, which are literally things that were enshrined, that were done in the past, and that were effective within a certain context, right? And to your point, as the world around us changes and that context changes, what was a marvelous solution at one point may not be as effective anymore. So how can they go out and acquire some of these skills? What are some of the things that you would recommend that they do to become, for lack of a better word, more future foresightful?
The term that comes to mind is a term that was made popular by a noted, more of a systems person and a business consultant. His name was Peter Senge. He wrote a very famous book in the early 1990s called The Fifth Discipline. And he wrote and his friends then wrote a handbook later on, which made this point even more clearly. They called it a learning organization. A learning organization is an organization that, the best way to describe a learning organization is its opposite, which I will call a knowing organization. A knowing organization has it. It says, oh, we understand. We've got a market. We've got a product, a government. We know how to run the world. We know how to, create policies, taxes, and regulations and things like that. There's no more questions left. Well, guess what? There are questions. And a learning organization is one that doesn't throw away the past. Some of those best practices are not completely terrible. They're not as effective as they used to be, but sure, there's some value in them. But there are new practices also. And how do we learn those things? By keeping open and asking questions. How many organizations put questions at the staff meeting, put questions at the board meeting, who really say, what do we need to learn to be successful now compared to 20 or 30 years ago? And I would say that's a rare commodity in most organizations. So how do you prepare for change? By first of all realizing you don't really know what's going to happen exactly. You know, kind of expected future. And when you don't know, what's the first thing to do is to learn. Keep learning, keep noticing change, and because most organizations, in order to keep things straight and indeed orderly, I mean, after all, they're called organizations for a reason, because they are organized. And learning is not an organized practice. Learning in school is, because you got a textbook, you got a teacher, and you answer questions and do homework and take a test and blah, blah, blah. That's organized learning. But then you get out after school and, oh my God, they didn't prepare me for this. They didn't tell me how to do this. I don't know how to do this. This is brand new. We do not teach students to be learners. In my estimation, we teach students to be students. It's not lifelong learning, it's lifelong studying. And nobody wants to be a lifelong studier. They want to be a learner. But that kind of disorganized, chaotic even, unpredictable learning is not emphasized in education. So learning organizations, there are some, but they're rare.
So that leads almost into the response, I think, to my next question, which was, how can these community leaders, so you have these communities within these big companies, you have the women's organization, you have the veterans organization, and the world around them is evolving. They're looking to support their communities and at the same time make their communities impactful within the organization, supportive of a larger organization. How can these communities and groups teach their members to also become more future foresightful, more adaptable to the fact that the world is changing and it's changing really rapidly. And I'd love to hear your response to that, but I think you already went there with the last answer you gave me.
Well, one of the cultural problems we have, and this is largely in the public sphere, in government and politics, and I think it's true even in organizations which are not quite so public, is that we are not allowed to say, I don't know. Honestly, we don't know. There was a press conference. Anthony Fauci, of course, the figurehead of the response to COVID 4 or 5 years ago, had an early press conference at the White House, at the podium there. And journalists were saying, how big is this? I don't know. When is it going to end? I don't know. What's the reason for it? I don't know. I mean, they kept badgering him because on behalf of the public, and they were not just being journalists, they needed answers so they could print them in the paper and put them online and put them on broadcast television. And he kept saying, we do not know. And he was brave, I think, in saying we do not know. And he said later, he says, what if I had said, here's what we know, and then I turn out to be wrong? Well, now it's even worse. So let's just admit what we know and what we don't know. The other side of that is what we can know and what we can choose is actually a third future. The expected future is where we're headed. The alternative future is where we may end up instead, both inbound futures. But there's outbound futures. Outbound is a third future, which is our preferred future. What's our vision? What are we working towards? What do we really want to achieve in the kind of world we want to live in? That has to do with our values. It has to do with all kinds of things that leaders need to do. So I need to make a distinction. You asked about community leaders. I actually distinguish between authorities, people who are in charge of things, and leaders. Authorities have the rights and the responsibility to make decisions for groups of people, whether it's employees or customers or citizens or whatever. Leaders promote fundamental change. Leaders promote change. So if they are to prepare the community for change, they need to be leaders. And they need to say, this is our preferred future. It will be difficult to achieve. And of course, Teach the Future, I would say, is an example of that. Bringing futures into schools is devilishly difficult. We have made actually not as much progress as I would have expected 10 years from now. That's because my skills or whatever are what they are. But nevertheless, we have a vision and we move towards it. So as I said, when the visiting team shows up, we have our game to play too. And we have our resources and strategies to play too. So while at the same time we are adapting to change coming to us, we are also moving through the water towards a goal that we set, and we choose ourselves. Because the world will allow us to do that, the world needs it, or we simply want to exercise our values and make life for ourselves and our families and our communities better. So keeping that in balance, the inbound and the outbound, what could happen to us and what we want to achieve, to me, is, again, a set of skills that young people should be considering while they're in school.
Yeah, it sounds to me, Peter, like a lot of people just focus in on the strategy of what they're going to do organizationally. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take these steps. We're going to do these particular actions. But the step that they skip, which is the step that you just so wonderfully illustrated, is the fact that you need to have some kind of vision, which is your outbound future. Yes. Where is it that you want to drive the bus, as opposed to what's coming toward you? And I think that's really an important piece. And I don't think a lot of groups actually do the work in that area. And I think that's really important work, to put that stake out there. And this is where we want to go. So that takes me to the next question, which is, in your thinking, should most corporate leaders today, including the CEO, the chief diversity officer, these employee community leaders, all be, if not full futurists, at least futurists light, in order to be able to do their work? Because clearly, in order to lead, they need to design a vision, and designing a vision has a lot to do with looking forward and asking yourself, where do I want to land? Where do I want to be given the dynamics that are happening around me? What are your thoughts on that?
I make a distinction between professional foresight, which we were educating and still are educating career professionals in future studies and foresight at the University of Houston, graduating hundreds and hundreds of people to go into the world. Not all of them chose that as a career, but a healthy number do, and many of them, the founders of the APF, most of them were graduates of the University of Houston. So there is that version of foresight. That's not necessary for everyone. We use the term futures literacy, the ability to handle change, understand change, the ability to see ahead, both the expected and the alternative futures, the ability to set a vision and communicate that vision as a leader to a group of people who you hope you can recruit to support that vision. That's futures literacy. The analogy I use is with financial literacy. You don't have to be able to do double entry bookkeeping to know that you have to save money. You have to, for your retirement, for your kids' education, you have to pay your credit card bills. You have to, put your money in relatively safe and instruments and things like that. That's financial literacy. In fact, we don't teach enough of that in school either because we're so focused on the academic stuff. People know more about the battles of the Civil War than they know about saving money. Well, to me, that's a total misapplication of the time we have. We have 16 years officially with young people to prepare them for the future. It's a huge missed opportunity that we're not teaching them to be literate. I mean, not just financially literate, but media literate, information literate in terms of parenting, in terms of being an employee and things like that, or being an entrepreneur. We do not teach those things because, and I'm a professor, so I love the academics. But that's not what they should be there for. They should be there to learn the skills of being successful in the future, not just the information in history and science from the past. So, literacy is the way at not just the CEO, the person working at the call center, the person driving the Uber vehicle, the guy working in the construction site ought to be always thinking about what could happen next and how can we make this better. If they were just asking those two questions, and we're not asking those questions in school, we should be.
So what resources do you recommend listeners get their hands on who want to learn more about these skills of being able to not only read these signals, whether they're weak or strong, and to move toward creating the futures that they want?
There are books, of course. You can search, on your favorite bookseller and for future studies, foresight, those kind of things. We, of course, have a website, teachthefuture.org, that has a library. It has teaching materials, and not just teaching materials. Everyone could benefit from reading the articles and taking some of the tools on that. We have a few books for young people. One book is for middle school students. One is for high school students. We have courses for adults, which we teach and have taught over and over again, which is a summary version. It's a 3-day version of the master's degree, enough to equip working professionals with the concept of futures literacy and with the ability, and some of the tools indeed, to actually practice it. It's most popular among people who are kind of analysts, mid-level technical people who've been given a job. A lot of them come and say, well, my boss just said I have to, write this paper about the future. Do you know how to do that? I said, yes, this is the course for you. So there's learning, there's courses, and there's materials available.
Fantastic. And how can our listeners reach you, Peter?
Peter at teachthefuture.org.
Fantastic. Peter, thank you again for being on ERG Power Talk. I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure, Joseph. Thank you for having me.
Okay, here is what I got out of the second half of our discussion with Peter. 1, Change is accelerating and the skills needed for success are evolving rapidly. More than ever, traditional knowledge isn't enough. Adaptability and ongoing learning are essential as the world around us changes in unforeseen ways. 2, to thrive amid this rapid change, your community should become learning organizations which are open to questions and new knowledge rather than relying solely on established practices, often called best practices. Adopting this mindset allows your organization to be more flexible and responsive to change. 3, since the current education system only prepares students for past conditions rather than the unpredictable future, we need to proactively teach ourselves and our communities to be more future literate. Reading and having your members read some of the books Peter recommended in this program are a good start. 4, if you don't already have a vision for your group, you should consider developing one right away. Effective leaders promote change by creating a clear vision or outbound future for where they want to lead their groups. This will help your community to navigate toward long-term goals rather than merely reacting to present challenges. And finally, 5, strive to increase the future literacy of all your members. Just as individuals benefit from understanding basic financial principles, future literacy, the ability to anticipate change, explore potential scenarios, and set a preferred course of action, is a valuable skill for everyone, not just professional futurists or you as the group leader or your managers or your executive leaders. Integrating this literacy into everything else that you do will empower your members to be better prepared for what lies ahead. The power of vision and the ability to navigate into the future is seen in many great success stories. Take, for example, Amazon. In the 1990s, Jeff Bezos envisioned an everything store on the internet when the idea was barely comprehensible. Starting with books, he saw the internet's potential to radically change retail. Bezos navigated Amazon through many challenges with a relentless long-term focus, even as critics questioned his strategy. Today, Amazon's vision not only transformed retail, but also expanded into cloud computing, AI, and more, setting it apart as a global powerhouse. Bezos' commitment to that long-term vision and growth exemplifies how foresight and having a clear vision can drive sustained success. By following the example of visionary, future-literate leaders like Jeff Bezos, ERG leaders can achieve high impact through a clear vision and long-term focus, navigating obstacles and marshaling supportive trends until they reach their destinations, their desired future. So now is the time for your ERG to set bold, transformative goals, leveraging resources, and embracing a forward-thinking mindset. Start building a future-focused strategy that will lead your ERG to the sustained success you want, reshaping your workplace and creating value for all. Thank you for tuning in to ERG Power Talk. If you enjoyed and got value out of this program, please like us and leave a favorable review at your podcast provider's site. Also, invite others to listen to the show. By the way, contact me if you're looking for an ERG Symposium keynote or a leader for your strategy workshop, new chair onboarding, and or ERG bootcamp. I can run these for you either in person or in a virtual setting. Also, for more great ideas and tips for your ERGs, get my books, Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG/BRG Strategy, and the new DEI and ERG Frontier, how you and your efforts can rise and thrive in the new world of constant disruption. Both available on Amazon.com. I'm Joe Santana. Thanks again for tuning in.